very different norms. So now we come to something which may be an ongoing trend, which is something we call androgyny. Of course, it's been around, especially in popular culture or in music. You'd see people who do not conform to either what they call binary gender roles like male or female, which is binary means there are two. You have this movement called non-binary, where people refuse to conform to either pure masculine or pure feminine. So you have something in between, like to go back to the example on anime and manga from the previous lecture, you see a lot of characters which sometimes you can't tell whether they're male or female. And this is, in a way, is a trend to show that we've become postmodern or post-structural in some aspects. But androgyny can also be considered like a state of mind or a philosophy or a phenomenology where people don't necessarily do anything about their appearance, but it's more like a state of mind where one does not believe that certain jobs are more suitable for women. In the past, of course, in the 1950s, even in the West, it was normal for women to be housewives. If they went to college at all, it was to find a husband and then they'll get married and stay at home. And especially during that time, it was particularly difficult for a college graduate to even pursue a career because it was kind of unheard of. And of course, the option would be to be a good wife, like what they call a Stepford wife, and take care of one's husband and be involved in childcare. So androgyny here could really refer to moving away from the binary stereotype where you could do anything you want regardless of whether you're male or female. You could be a female pilot, you could be a male chef or model or whatever. So, is gender a social construct? What we can see is that most sociologists think so. We can look at gender as a social category or a social fact, and it functions like a social institution to maintain the social order in a Parsonsian AGIL sense. So it entails a social identity and a social role. And if we examine gender from the three main perspectives, from the functionalist perspective, biological sex determines gender roles. For example, men are always assigned the instrumental or logical roles, like in nomadic societies, in prehistoric societies. Men were, of course, the hunter-gatherers, and women were always assigned the expressive or nurturing roles, like childcare. And from the conflict theory perspective, the ontology was that there was a traditional division of labor where males tended to be included in property and decision making, and this excludes females. So in most societies, especially the more advanced or industrialized ones, you would see more patrilineal or patriarchal tendencies. And from the symbolic interactionist point of view, gender is something that's socially constructed, and we learn this through socialization, like when children play with dolls and then they have toys in pink or in blue, and that's how they know what's feminine or masculine. And so this symbolic exchange reproduces the gender inequality. So now we come to feminism, which is the response towards this gender inequality. And this was a belief in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. And there were three main waves of feminism. The first wave started in the 1920s with the suffrage movement, where women demanded the right to vote in the West. And in the second wave, from the 1960s to the 1970s, this was when women wanted more than just the right to vote, but they also wanted the rights to employment and education. As we saw just now, in the 1950s, it was very uncommon for women to be working or even to pursue a higher education. So they wanted to move in the second wave of feminism to be able to be taken seriously as professionals. And in the current third wave, it's more about expanding these rights to be more accepting of diversity. Because the first wave was said to be more towards white women's suffrage, and it wasn't that inclusive in terms of women of other ethnicities. So just look at some key feminist theorists. We have Simone de Beauvoir, who believed that one is not born, but one becomes a woman. And there is Anne Oakley, who separated the analysis of sex from gender. And there is Haywood and Gale, who believe that men and masculinity and their values are always defined as the mainstream, and what isn't the mainstream will be defined as what's feminine. Like again, the example of being aggressive, being strong is the norm, and running like a girl is considered to be weak. And then you have Sylvia Walby, who believed that patriarchy is composed of 6 structures, including household and work. And you have Wick Seidler, who believed that masculinity is always synonymous with being logical or having reason. And of course, females are considered to be emotional. And you also have Anne Foster Sterling, who believed that actually there are 5 sexes and there is a model for it based on your chromosomal differences. And then Bob Connell, later on known as Raywin Connell, who talk about hegemonic masculinity. And Judith Butler, as we mentioned earlier, who believed that gender is really a performance. It's like a role that we play in a theatre, like dramaturgical analysis by Goffman. And for Marshall and Witts, they believe that in most discourses, we always prefer the male point of view, which is called androcentrism. So it used to be called history and not her story. And in the past, you'd have words like mankind and things like that. So the feminist epistemology is that all knowledge is produced within relations of power, and because knowledge is often produced within masculine frameworks, most knowledge is gendered, and that's expressed through the language. So just to recap briefly, the main theories of the feminist theorists, like for example Simone de Beauvoir, she wrote in her book, The Second Sex, that one is not born a woman, but becomes one. And she suggests that the category of women is a wearable cultural accomplishment, and that no one is born with a gender, but is acquired. And of course, we've talked about Butler, who believed that gender is fluid, and that there is more than one defining point to what is gender. The identity of women is not necessarily contingent upon their gender, because they are individuals too. And sexuality is not the underlying definitive of gender. And culture does not assume gender identity, and to take a binary view is too limiting. So, giving somebody a gender is like a label, it's like labeling. And it's the same thing with gender, race, and class. And of course, Bob or Raywin Connell believed that men make masculinity according to the social situation in which they find themselves. And so Connell criticized the sex role and gender socialization, where gender inequalities are explained in terms of biology, and the difference is understood as a deviation from the normative mode of masculinity or femininity. And gender roles are vague, and gender socialization also supports the status quo by ignoring power relations. And as mentioned earlier, we have the concept of second shift, where married women also have to play the roles of housewife or mother and be involved in childcare. This is by Ali Hochschild, who talk about how among employed people with families, women work a double day or second shift, comprised of additional time spent on housework and childcare compared to men. And while women's roles have changed substantially to include both family and work, men's roles, work demands, and demands of child rearing have changed very little. So if someone holds a purely equal or egalitarian ideology, they would expect that men and women identify in the same spheres, which is the public and the private, or the domestic and the public, which is to say both must do their equal share in terms of work, family, or some combination, and share power within the marriage equally. So how do we trace the beginnings of feminist thought? We can go all the way back to perhaps the end stage of the Enlightenment, where we had the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the book The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. And she argued that women ought to have an education commensurate with their position in society. And so she proceeded to redefine that position and claimed that women are essential to the nation because they educate the children, and they could also be companions to their husbands, rather than just mere wives. Instead of viewing women as ornaments to society or property to be traded in marriage, Wollstonecraft maintains that they are human beings deserving of the same fundamental rights as men. And then you also have another philosopher, Olympe de Gouges, who wrote about the Declaration on the Rights of Women shortly after the French Constitution of 1791. And she was alarmed that the Constitution, which was supposed to promote equal suffrage, it did not include women's suffrage in France. So she wanted to include this, and so she wrote this declaration using Enlightenment logic that if in nature the equality and the working together of the two sexes achieves harmony, so should France achieve a happier and more stable society if women are given equality among men. Okay, so now we come to the three waves of feminism. And the first wave of feminism refers to a period of feminist activity during the 19th century and early 20th century. And this focused primarily on gaining the rights of women to vote in the West. So the term first wave was coined retrospectively after the term second wave feminism began to be used in the 1970s to describe a newer feminist movement that focused as much on fighting social and cultural inequalities as they did with political inequalities. And then you have the second wave of the women's movement, which began during the early 1960s and lasted all throughout the late 1970s. While the first wave feminism focused mainly on getting women the right to vote, second wave feminism addressed a wider range of issues, including unofficial inequalities, official legal inequalities, sexuality, family, the workplace, and the most controversially, reproductive rights. And of course, the famous book written by a second wave feminist during this time was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. So by the early 1980s, which we often associate with power dressing or women finally entering the workforce and being taken seriously as professionals, it was largely perceived that women had met their goals and succeeded in changing social attitudes towards gender roles. So the roots of the third wave of feminism began in the mid-1980s. So the thing is that feminist leaders rooted in the second wave called for a new phenomenology or subjectivity in feminist voice. So they sought to negotiate prominent space within feminist thought for consideration of race-related subjectivities. So the third wave of feminism had an agenda where they wanted to create domestic abuse shelters for women and children, acknowledge abuse and rape of women on a public level, allow access to contraception, and enforcement of sexual harassment policies for women in the workplace, childcare services, and equal or greater educational and extracurricular funding for young women. So this is of course mainly in the West, in Europe and in the US. So now we come to the spectrum of feminisms, which really branch out into so many categories, mainly during the second wave. So first we have liberal feminism, which arose from social contract theories of the 16th and 17th centuries, or the Enlightenment period, is based on the values of rationality and reason, liberty and equality. So liberal feminists believe that women and men are equal and have the same capacities and abilities, and thus women have the right to the same opportunities as men. So they wanted affirmative action, reproductive rights legislation, educational reforms, and equal opportunity legislation. And what they wanted was not to overthrow the entire system, but just to kind of refine it a bit to achieve gender equity by working within the system. On the other extreme end of the spectrum is radical feminism. So they're on the left wing, and they believe that the subjugation of women is the most basic and fundamental oppression. So their enemies are patriarchy, male domination, and men's control over women's bodies, and they believe that all these are responsible for women's oppression. And so radical feminists assume that all women, regardless of class, sexual orientation, or ethnic background, share this common problem. In contrast with liberal feminists, who see value in working within the existing system, radical feminists call for a complete reorganization of society by eliminating any concentration of male power, emphasizing instead the ethics of mutuality and interdependency. Some famous theorists here would be Bell Hooks and Campbell and Wasco. So then we have in between some movements like cultural feminism, which actually shares characteristics with both conservatism and more radical feminist theories. And they take an essentialist standpoint and maintain that there is a range of biologically based gender differences. But at the same time, they want to acknowledge and value these differences rather than to keep women in subordinate positions. So to some extent, they believe in biological destiny, but not to oppress anyone with it. And you have socialist feminism, which is also located towards the left side, and they maintain that there is no primary root of oppression, but that all forms of oppression, such as sexism, racism, ethnocentrism, homophobia, heterosexism, and classism, support and reinforce one another. So the famous theories under here would be Audre Lorde, who believed that there is no hierarchy of oppression. And she argued that to address any one form of oppression, we must consider all of them simultaneously. So they put all and one as the same. Then you have the movement that's more towards ethnic diversity, which is the women of color feminism or womanism. Womanism recognizes the specific concerns that women of color might face in a patriarchal society. While women of color experience sexism, on top of that, they also face issues of poverty, racism, and ethnocentrism. Because womanists recognize the existence of multiple oppressions, they do not necessarily view men of color as their enemy. In fact, women of color may choose to ally themselves with men of color to work together to end racism and other forms of oppression. So now we come to families as socialization agents that transmit norms and values that lead towards gender differences. Here is just a glossary of terms. So family would be defined as a set of people related by blood, marriage, or some other agreed upon relationship, or even adoption, who share primary responsibility for reproduction and caring for members of society. Then you have different types of family like nuclear family, which is the nucleus or core upon which larger family groups are built. Usually this entails the parents and the children. And the extended family, in which the relatives live in the same home as the parents and their children. The uncles, aunts, and the grandparents and everything. And when you have a patriarchy, then you have a system where males are expected to dominate in all family decision making and also in economic resources. And a matriarchy is where women have greater authority than men. Best of all is you have an egalitarian family in which both spouses, male and female, are regarded as equals. So from the functionalist